I'm going to do a quick speed date through our opening slides to just kind of get our heads back into why we were here, what we're talking about. Theoretically, that will work. All right, so real quick. So I kind of started off with, well, what the heck are we talking about? DevOps, DevSecOps. There's a bunch of questions people have as they look at this space. Encourage everybody to read the Phoenix Project. If you've never read that, it'll help you think of why are we thinking of doing this. DevOps is fairly well understood, and the Air Force said, but it's not enough. And because industries that need it, but they didn't really say what else is needed to make sec. They say you need DevSecOps, but they didn't tell you what that was. So why are we here? We got customers and buyers. We got system implementers. We've got pipeline vendors came in and spoke with us. We've got a couple of niche service providers and tool providers talking along and some of their challenges. OMG is a great place to have this conversation. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing, and it's working pretty well so far. We had some good speakers, and we had a great conversation. So let's just kind of reset the stage of what we went through today. So any high-level thoughts from you guys after having talked through this for the day?
Well, since nobody else is speaking up, I will.
Yeah.
And I didn't get a chance to see all the presentations. I think I missed two. Right. So I had other commitments today. But I was pleasantly surprised to some extent to find out that the orphanage is sort of full of Oliver twists, and everybody actually had pretty much a complaint along the same lines that I did, that we really need to get a lot more concrete with their language and what's going on. And so that I was surprised. I did not expect to see that. Just so coming in green, not knowing a good many of you. So that was pleasant for me, and I know that the ONG has groups that take an even deeper interest in that. So I don't know if I see anybody in ontology here, but
we'll bring them in later after we make some progress.
It's a huge located that much. I'll tell Alyssa you said that.
Say Mike said that.
Yes.
So that for me was I think a pretty positive takeaway. I learned something, or at least was reminded of something that I probably should have remembered from Bill here. And I'm going to struggle to find the right words, right? Because I didn't obviously have time to prepare for this. But in some sense, Bill reminded me that DevSecOps is not a passive activity. It is an active, ongoing activity, right? And that ties together with something I was thinking about this morning, but I didn't articulate in, I believe it was your presentation. That there's a conversation that seems to me about three different areas where DevSecOps applies. So again, the evil number 3 appears, but it's not factored against those three. There is an element of process documentation that says, here's how we do things. Where is your plan, right? You can audit that by observing it, right? Then there is what I would call a development time presence, right? Of those facets, which are more analytical in the sense that you're running tools against code. You're getting output products. You can assemble those products into some sort of a common types of report. We're actually doing that on my team right now. In fact, I was the one who started it. I'll tell you about that in a moment. And the third is the runtime aspect. This is where you were sort of talking about port scanning, Nessus, things like that, right? So this is happening at 3 different phases of the life cycle, right? As you move around that big grade. So I definitely resonated with, I forgot the second speaker's name, so I apologize, but the Army Q ops, kind of proposal. And I was very interested right from the get-go on our team about integrating the various outputs of all these analysis tools, right? And because at that point, I wasn't going to be able to utilize that to make, so to speak, my government customer happy, right? Unless I had something I could integrate and present. So I went and started script kiddying myself and started coding things to integrate it all together, which is of course then, as the usual process works when you're in charge of a decent sized team, they decided to all work Saturday in order to prevent me from doing it.
Oh, the boss is gonna do it, give me that.
So I was gonna sling code, but they were like, okay, we can't let that happen, which was probably for the better.
Yeah.
So, but in any case, we did. We got actually a really, really nice integrated report from, software bill of materials to covariety static analysis findings, right? And dependency maps. And then, of course, tracking all the output products with Git hatches and MD files and whatnot. So really nice. So that, I think, was sort of in the infancy of where I'd like to go. And that happened in that middle piece of the life cycle, right? So that's sort of development or build area. Really doesn't incorporate anything from the runtime on the process side. Wasn't concerned with that at the moment. But so that's just some thoughts that I had about what I have seen today. So before go to Fredo.
So, and then we briefly mentioned this earlier with the questions, but I'll bring it back up because it's still one of the ones that gets me. So I'm at Mantech and we create models and, and we send them off to cyber vulnerability assessment tools or hypervisors to do a true digital twin to attack. And that always is like, oh, that's cool, that's wow. But we also, as we talked about before, how do you get them to buy into the governance of, so before you sit down and model a system and then perform all the analysis on it that you need to keep continuously monitoring a system, what about precursors to that, setting up the governance and the requirements to, how do you get the buy-in from your customers to get them to be able to say, no, we do need that as well?
You write the controls for them, write their change control for it and their change management plan for them. Write everything for them. Do not allow them any aspect, because if you try to inherit all their controls, you will fail because they're not there. Give it to them. If you give it to them, they'll do it. We had to write for a system that we did. We had to write all the controls for somebody who didn't have them. So they stole it from us. They said, well, this is a finding because we don't have a CCB. I said, well, there is one for this system. Really? Yep. Well, when did it meet last? Well, it meets tomorrow. And they stole it. It's their CCB. They stole the document. They stole everything. And it took us, 3 or 4 days to write the configuration management plan. Don't let anything to chance. Nothing. And if you do that, right, and you draw the circle all the way around, sure, they may not use this piece or that piece or this piece or that piece, but the pieces that the organizational controls is always where this fails. Always. And it doesn't mean the system controls aren't hard and there's not a lot of work there. I don't mean to minimize that. That's a lot of work. But the organizational controls always get left to the end. And there is no computer security without organizational controls.
Right.
Back to my joke this morning, right? If you don't have a rule that you can't write your PIN in a Sharpie on your smart card, you don't have anything.
Well, that points out often you don't know that you need a rule until you find that vulnerability. Some ding dong wrote their pin on it.
Yes.
So it's kind of a chicken or egg problem. You do the best you can with what you know, and you try to fill the gaps as much as you can. I think, Jason, you can correct me, but I think a lot of what the Navy's been doing is just trying to catch up on the dev and get it in this, dev and operate, and then let's catch up there. Yes, we need to think about secure and governance at the same time, but it's kind of going at the speed of light, just trying to catch up with the 20th century.
Yeah, so we're kind of taking, and that is the correct answer. And the reason that, you dealt with enough of us as customers. The government is a boring customer. So some of us recognize that. One is
Wonderful.
just recognition. It came up again right as I was walking in. There was discussion about the contract. Who actually are sitting as the COR, under contract, or that write the contract and what they're asking for. They will go ask the technical guys for some feedback into it, but the technical guys are like, that's a waste of my time. So they'll buy the barest bones, and then they'll try and flesh that out, and they'll have a whole bunch of back and forth, and but it's still going to be it's acquisitions that generally provides. Sometimes you have diamonds in the rough that you'll find, but by and large, they don't know what they're asking. So then it falls down on the vendor to, well, okay, I'm gonna keep this customer happy. You know where this needs to go, it's gonna fall off the rails if you, with it. Yeah, if you can find to just do it, and then just know that you're gonna have to educate why it's important. If you're in a low risk project, you can let them fall on their face somewhere with it where, red team constantly, right? It's helpful for them to learn a lesson. I mean, just like, but it's a lot. You just have to remember that from their experience, and this has been difficult for me coming into a combat system community where I started. The level of understanding that they have of things is just completely different. And there's just a different background that they grew up in. Not to oversimplify, but I push a button, missile fires, missile hits something. That's some of your customers. That's kind of the level of understanding, and some of them are comfortable being there. But yeah, it really is industry that kind of does understand where this needs to go, and it's going to be 10 steps down the line to try and help the customer get where they.
Pity the colonel or captain who gets their star becoming an AO somewhere, which is what happens, right? That's how they taunt them into the, will we be responsible for all the cyber of this, organization? No. Well, what if you give you a star?
I'll give you a star.
How long do I have to do this? And then they're completely dependent on it. And if they've got a good staff, they're in pretty good shape. And if they don't have a good staff, they're in really bad shape. So, just don't give them a choice. Always put the complete right answer on the table. And you guys have the doc. You just have to steal it from somewhere else. Because reciprocity may not be very functional, but doc theft is awesome. Right? Search and replace, and there you go. You got a change control management plan. And there are enough projects at your organization that you could just go to another project and steal some doc. I mean, you've got to get a little permission, but.
And if we do this enough times.
No, you lost.
No, but it is a thing, and they'll actually encourage it. And they won't have to do it. And now, you as an organization, as a service organization, are in an even better posture because you know how to do this. You know what the rules are, and there are 3 states. Rules you don't know what they are. Rules you do know what they are, and the 3rd state is there are no rules. And that's the common case. So it's actually better to be in the state where you don't know what the rules are because you can go learn them, or to provide the rules. So just provide the rules, and they may push them aside and say, okay, see what I'm saying?
Requirements start somewhere.
And because the dissimilarity in the organizational requirements for these systems is very small. It's always the same, right? The roles are defined as the same. They, these ICDs and RMF policies that have come out over time, and the upwards and so forth, there is a lot of commonality to them, and people it's just overwhelming that there are people within your organization that have already done this. Just steal.
Yeah, and truthfully, most of your customers will appreciate this anyway, because, for the same reason that you got to force somebody to put that star on to take over something that you're basically just kind of cringing for 3 years, hoping nothing happens, is they generally don't know what they don't know, let alone what they do know about this. And so if you can trace pedigree back to somebody else that seemed to have an answer, it starts to reinforce, okay, there is some rules I can, start to comprehend, how this can work. Somebody else has already thought through. I'm not the first one kind of cringing, hoping nothing falls off falls off the rails with it.
It is a career challenge for the military because they rotate people, and there's enough depth of knowledge base here that it really needs to be in all the areas, right? If you become an artillery officer, you need to learn cyber.
Well, it's interesting. Our Admiral O'Connor, actually shortly after the forge got stood up by the captain who kind of kicked off the facility, the software factory and location with it, came and actually asked her staff to put together, what is that roadmap that would get me, like a DevOps engineer. So she's an engineer and duty officer, and that's the community that they've got, but they were trying to actually, what are
Great
these
one.
pipeline jobs that I should do, different things, industry participation and whatnot. So it's being discussed and thought about at that level about where that falls in. And if we're doing it within the Navy, we're probably further behind.
And the Air Force has a very unique position on this, because the Air Force has gone through a career crisis anyway, because of, I was sitting next to this kid who was a young Air Force officer on a plane, and I go, what do you do? And he goes, well, I guess I'm a pilot. And I said, but no airline career for you? And he goes, no. And so, that's all, because, you look at the Air Force historically, all the flags are pilots, and, it's a pilots organization, and and they got that stolen away from them. And so they, I think cyber may fill in some of that career aspect, but it really needs to become pervasive across the career spectrum for, it's like the basics. It shouldn't be just one of the 2-year stints, you know what I mean? It should pervade everything, because you can't be an artillery officer without, something about cyber, because you can't order a major system that does artillery and pay for it later in your career unless you, because that's the thing that's going to bite you. Software is always the hidden cost.
All right, so let me shift back here to standards for a minute. And we're all sitting in this room and we're thinking like, this is the place to do these standards. Are you guys aware of anybody in the room or through your networks aware of other standards bodies or other standards activities that are going on in this space? And even if you don't have that answer here in the room, it's really a charged question asked to all of us to open our ears as we go back and we come back to the next meeting, because there's no reason to recreate the wheel if different parts of this landscape are getting hit in the DevSecOps space.
Well, will we ever have any sort of bumping heads or overlap with, say, OWASP or SEO?
Yeah, I don't know. So, as I was Googling around last night, or not that I was finishing my briefing at 11:30 p.m. or anything.
I was at too.
Okay, good.
The security guards chased me out of one.
Well, what do you know? Carnegie Mellon has their own,
Yeah.
version of it, so like, I see no need to recreate the wheel if there's things we can leverage or if there's things we need to get here. Is anybody aware of any?
Yeah, so some of our early training and DAU early on brought in CMU SEI to look at some of the stuff. I know they had some standard definitions. We actually glommed onto a few of those as we were starting to do training early on, but it's actually been a couple of years since I've had direct involvement with that. So I don't know how far that's matured kind of past that point and how deep they've gotten into sort of like the breakout across the cycle. Not sure if anybody else is.
And would SEI deign to participate in a forum like this, or?
So with the handful of folks and how willing the couple of professors were that were dealing with DAU as they were standing up that kind of DevSecOps course a couple of years ago, I believe they would with it. Obviously, staff change-outs and different things, I can't say for sure, but I mean, they seemed very engaged as they were helping DAU stand up, some forces on this.
Yes. Interesting to maybe our OMG staff can help you. Yes.
So, DMU does have some information on software acquisition.
Yeah, the
Like
pathway.
pathway.
Yep.
And so with where some of this, so where some of these things fall, it may change, some of the standardized terminology based on whether it's more on the planning or the execution side of things. It may just be a consideration.
So whenever you talk about standards, we have to talk about economics. We never talk about economics here, but it's the gorilla in the room, always. You got customer economics, you got supplier economics, you got vendor economics, you got contractor economics, you got all these different economics. Choose your economics. we had a front row seat to the entire software-defined radio forum, because all the stuff was based on our products. And the government put a meat cleaver between the platform vendors and the waveform vendors, right? And the idea is you could run any waveform on any platform. And, you know, few exceptions, you know, some hardware outside of the scope of the standard, you know, were troublesome, but other than that, they actually achieved that pretty well. And the question is, how do you want to split it up, right? So you've got to think this through. Because as Ben was saying this morning, standards create realms for competition. So who do you want to compete with who and how? So one, the standards for nomenclature would be a wonderful thing. That serves everybody well. Now, as soon as you do interoperability standards, or you can even do framework standards, or you can do API standards, because when you were bringing up the diagram of the ship and, you know, the various acronyms, you know, I was thinking, so what's the severability, right? What can come from different vendors, right? What's the, you know, how does this all work and what's the reuse? Can I use this on my garrison environment? Can I take it out of the Navy and put it in garrison environment in the Army? And can I use it somewhere else? And but if you decide, right, if we as a group think about the economic interest in the room, both from the customer side, contractor side, the vendor side, then that's a good thing. Because what normally happens here is somebody's got a product and it's not standards conforming. So they run into say, hey, we need to do a Flibit.
Standard around my thing.
Can I standardize my Flibit? Right? And it's not usually standards and products. It's usually there's some technology that somebody wants to standardize. And then you don't actually get the effect of the competition, right? Because anyway, there's a whole thing here, and it's normal standards groups politics, whether at ISO or ANSI or anywhere else. But we can decide this, right? You can actually have this discussion, and if it's a fairly open discussion of, you know, if there's some natural competition, let's get some touch points. Let's deal with how there can be more, you know, if you're talking about, you know, call them CAD vendors, right? Computer-aided design vendors, right? Do you want at least a file format, right? What is it you want to achieve in the end system? And that's what needs to be, when you get into the DevSecOps business, there aren't a lot of, you know, we got all this infrastructure based on it, and there are very little actual software evaluations, right? You know, can we actually do a formal evaluation of Kubernetes, right? Anybody done an information flow diagram? Anybody actually done analysis on it, right? You know, you can, there are certain scanning vendors, I won't name which ones, but that make little appliances that you can scan with, and they won't let you scan the appliance because it won't pass the scans. and so but if you define what the end state for the marketplace you're trying to achieve, and this is just good engineering to have this high level requirement of what are the 5 bullets that you're trying to achieve as the end result of this piece. And don't boil the ocean. Pick a piece and bound it and move on. And then people will invest, because people will not invest in developing technology or capability unless there's stability, right? We used to have somebody who ran Mars before Shar did, and she would just try to standardize anything. Are you killing me, girl?
It's okay.
You know who I'm talking about. And the point is, have purpose and intent for the marketplace that serves customers. Because if it doesn't serve a customer, just go home.
Right. It
Quit
doesn't,
going to standards groups.
don't make a tool for the sake of making a tool. Make a tool to solve a problem.
Yeah, there are some things going on elsewhere, and at OMG over the last 3 or 4 years that fall in the category of just wanting to chat. And you know, let's do something. Let's do something intelligent and useful and meaningful that has a compliance to it, so that everybody who has a market interest in that thing will go and invest in it. And it'll be and if you do it right, the standard will live for a long time. We shouldn't have to do things backwards. So I was having breakfast with a very high SES within the government, and he looks at me and he goes, "So Bill, how can we make face successful?" I said, "Well, that's easy. Just follow the successful example of jitters." And he looks at me like, "What are you, nuts? This is a JTRS, Joint Tactical Radio System." I said, "Well, you have to give $3.2 million to the non-incumbent vendors. And then what will happen is the threat of that competition will cause all the incumbent vendors to make all of their products, every Falcon 3 radio, every, all the R210 radios. The government never paid to make those compliant, and they're completely SCA compliant. And this was done."
So just to put that out there, when we did the 3 contracts off the OTA with it, the big integrator prime did not win any of those. And it is
So it's a change agent
it's a
exercise.
huge motivator back to, because part of it is, every big integrator is going to create its processes based on what the government customers do. I mean, they are going to mold themselves to the customer. So they create a bad self-licking ice cream cone after too much time goes on. But yeah, if you really want to motivate quick change with it, yes, find some way, whether it's the full award or a piece of it to just say, "Hey, we're interested in opening up competition on this." And if you care, it definitely, yeah.
Well, and you'll pay for what you want. And I will tell you, the big system integrators and the Mantecs of the world, they will do what you want. They are highly motivated to do exactly what you want. You just have to be careful that you don't create the other incentive, because they won't intend to not do what you want, but they will do what you pay them to do, because they have to, right? They absolutely have to. They've got large infrastructure and so forth. If you create a very crisp boundary, if you do a well-formed buy, you'll get what you want.
Yeah, and this, I mean, coming back to the standards piece, we led a contract RFP recently, a very large one for kind of moving away from the combat systems, engineering agents that we previously had with it. Had there been language we could have utilized down around some of the DevOps, themes and principles, we would have included it in the contract, but the contract was left, more open than we would have liked probably to, because you just couldn't use language that wasn't either marketing heavy or that wasn't going to lean or make it look like you were leaning towards a particular solution with it.
So I'll throw a posit parallel. So for years and years and years, the software world realized figuring out all the requirements first and then trying to build it and then hoping it delivers something was going to fail. So they came up with pair programming, extreme programming, Scrum kind of came in a line. So you had all these things that eventually people realized that that's agile software development. And it went on for a while. And then a bunch of smart people came together and they codified the Agile Manifesto, and the thou shalt do this over that, this over that, this over that, which actually set the framework for what are you talking about when you say Agile. I think we're kind of in a similar life cycle with DevOps and DevSecOps. It's matured to a point. It's fairly well understood, but it's not codified. So perhaps an element of a manifesto type declaration that brings more people to the table. We got a great group of people to the table here today, but I'm sure there's 5 people that really need to be in this conversation that we don't know, but they're not here. So we need to continue to push to make that place for that conversation to happen and kind of shame people into coming join the conversation and codify that manifesto. And then from there, we can start to work on the language and terms section. So when you're going to put in an RFP and you say, you need to have a DevOps pipeline and it's going to have these 23 features. Those features have meaning that don't favor AWS, they don't favor Red Hat, they don't favor Microsoft. And then from there, Bill, we would have those people in the room And then they can agree, well, okay, we got through that. What's our business case? Where in this whole landscape is going to help all of our business to set more standards?
See, there's a really good one right there. Each of the cloud vendors has a separate, different proprietary API for spinning up VMs,
Yeah.
right? Well, that's a standard. That
Yeah.
could be a standard.
Yeah.
That's a really easy standard to write too. I mean,
Our problem when we start tackling that space is, we can take a look at the Jedi contracts, what ended up happening. I mean,
yeah, but
that is a competitive space and a maintained competitive space because of the limited number. I mean, especially from DoD, you've got really two players. I mean, the other guys came in, a little bit later in the game with it and are very small and have a lot of work to kind of do, coming up through it. That's it, Google massive on the commercial side, but, late to the game with the government side of the house. Trying to get them to,
you don't have to. They're the incumbents. You don't give money to the incumbents. This is the system that works. And the incumbents will make their stuff either compatible or third parties will make gateway technologies that translate. I mean, I can see a bunch of gears running in the room right now. We could write a daemon that actually translates the standard invocations into the REST invocations for Amazon and also for Azure and for Oracle and for Google, right? Because the fundamental paradigm and VMware and Hyper-V, et cetera. And those organizations, if will initially say, I don't want to go do this thing. Who knows if anybody's actually going to do this? And they'll go deal with some smaller organizations, which they'd be ecstatic to do. So if you want, you cannot cause an organization that's getting significant money to disrupt themselves. It's the inventor's dilemma. If you do it the other way and make it a competitive threat, all you're really trying to do is get them compliant with the standard. They'll do it on their own nickel. Do you see what I'm saying?
They don't want to lose their market share. Yeah.
Right.
I'm just not sure how much of a market share we are in that space, whether or not we're big enough players.
Yeah, but
The government?
Well, so
We're not one government, like.
I know. That's the thing. But you said that earlier. I was going to make that comment. The government, because there's
even within the Navy, there are four
millions
navies,
of people in the
right?
government.
So it's, and even within those four navies, there's.
Whether we could get enough scale of impetus to push that. And I was trying to place it in my head. I mean, I was thinking back to like SIP and, some of the, exit protocols that they attempted to do that through some of those big players, and we just couldn't.
But you don't actually need all you need is a standardized interface to get to them.
So I would love to support that
Mhm.
for another reason, completely different than what you're doing. So if I have, at present, I'll describe the deployment environment that we work with, right? So when I put all those components on the screen and all those domains and product family and all that.
Were you the one with the tools RS picture?
Yes.
Yes, that was great.
But towards the end, I was talking about our components, right, that we assemble with pipelines. And our customer deliveries can be anything from, a small subset of those components that fits on nothing more than that laptop sitting back there, right?
Mhm.
To an on-premises deployment in a highly sensitive area, right? That uses a proprietary cloud or a series of VMs, all the way up to, say, a more Rancher Kubernetes kind of thing, very, very standard, or on an OpenShift from Red Hat or something. Again, very, very standard, right? But I've got a series of services that need to be elastic in all three of those environments, right? So I've got somebody who wants to add a new capability in, merely by configuration. And, the system should be able to provision new services to be launched elastically, right? And establish those configurations. And doing that at runtime, when you're, say, in a Rancher Kubernetes is one thing, versus just being conventional Unix processes on a laptop is another, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd like to have that common API to do that regardless of what my employment environment is. So again, now I'm not competing, the platform vendors like, say, for instance, Microsoft or Amazon, but I'm competing in my deployment environment.
And things like Kubernetes and Ansible, et cetera, all of these open source tools are not standards. And they don't have
Yes.
standards protocols.
Right,
They're completely proprietary protocols all the way through.
Right.
Now, they're not secret, right?
And they can be de
But they're
facto protocols.
unique and they will change. Yeah, that's right. They will change. So if you produce a standard, frequently those tools will just adapt to it.
Right.
I mean, you look at Corva. Corva's throughout Linux, right? There are 4 open source orbs in the middle of Linux, and a lot of the Linux communications inside of them are Corva. They got Orbit and a bunch of other orbs in there. And nobody knows and nobody cares, but it's actually part of the internal protocols. So a lot of these open source projects don't care. They will, whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
You know, in a DDS or a Corva or anything else, right? You know, pick something else. It could be a REST API, but having some interface definition, right, to the thing that you want, which is the ability to, and if you define DevSecOps in terms of if you literally go to that cyber.mil paper that I was referring to, right, and you literally just be clear and say, okay, maybe we can get some folks at OMG involved in the planning stage. So we can do, OB1s and OB2s and et cetera, and 81s and 82s and so forth. We'll do diagrams, and the diagrams actually end up generating interfaces, right? Or generating things that could actually be deployment plans. Because if you look at what DevSecOps is, right, infrastructure as code, right, that you can move your code between networks pretty easily. That's way easier to move than the VMs. If you think about your deployment plan, which products are you going to run on which VMs, and what are you going to run in them, and which VM vendor, and so forth. This is a fairly linear technical problem. It's not one of the more advanced technical problems. Now, how they all talk to each other and all the protocols and stuff, it's the mass of computer science. It's enormous. But the basic deployment plan, it's not hard. There's no open source connection broker, right? You know what a connection broker is? So Microsoft makes a connection broker. VMware has one. It's basically a thing that takes a connection from either RDP or PC over IP and then routes it to a VM for a user. And huge companies make their entire existence based on this very small amount of technology, which is, hey, when you go to that VM, we'll patch in some apps and we'll do some other things for you. Those are oddly, those APIs for each of those vendors about doing app provisioning and so forth, those are all published. They're just different. They're all different, but they actually, semantics of them are very, very similar. So there's a lot of companies out there who could produce these technologies, and you'll actually get some open source versions too, but you got to have, this group has to decide, are you going to actually have some support? Are you actually going to decide that there's economic opportunity for tools vendors to make things that allow DevSecOps for evaluated products within the government space? And you know what? Those are probably some pretty good products to use in the financial space and the transportation space and the medical space.
So we've had to, and this is, you mentioned COVID earlier, for good or bad. One of the good things of COVID is I get to work from home. But one of the hard things for the digital engineering leads at my company is how do I work from home? How do I, and my boss who's in California and my coworker who's in Alabama, work from home, right? And so right now we're using AWS, and that's the environment we're in. And we've got all of our different tools. My magic cyber systems engineers are calling it today, but who knows what they'll call it tomorrow. And MATLAB, and whatever, all the different tools. And so my point in saying that is, what you're saying is, I think Intech is not the only company doing this, right? So everybody's having to do the same thing. How are we getting our people to do what they need to do in one online space, keep it compliant, make sure no data is leaking down anywhere, right? And so what our digital engineering guys did was exactly what we talked about today. They automated the script. So when the AWS kicks out, it automates it. When I have new plugins for Magic Cyber that I need to push out so everybody can use them, they write it into their script, and it's all automated, nothing's manual.
And wouldn't it be cool if their scripts could make standard conformant calls so that they could deploy within Azure and Oracle, et cetera? And
Right,
and
that's
it
what-
would, and even that there will, because you look, these vendors, there are tools to take a VM from one environment to another.
Mhm.
It rips out the device driver, put the different one in, et cetera. You know, that's something a group like this could do, and it's low hanging fruit. It's ripe for the market. We might get a rush of cloud vendors all standing in here, but you know, that would be a bad thing. But they, yeah, I mean,
So,
Right, like it's these.
but Terraform would use
standard,
this.
it's necessary.
Well, could,
They could.
yes.
It's everybody's, we've even talked about AWS is probably not gonna be the one we stick with. We might need something else for this, that, and the other reason.
something else.
And so it's exactly what you're saying. And likewise, talking about tying it all together, the other, like, we're looking at SB Vision right now, but you're looking at a company that writes a tool that goes amongst all the different development tools that we have, and the data can transfer and move back and forth, and it doesn't matter whether you're using Doors or MATLAB or Magic Cyber, it's your data, whatever tool you need to use for that purpose, use it for that purpose, and at the end of the day, it's still your data being spit out, right? But how do we do this so that anybody accessing it from anywhere?
Right, so you got a common definition of what the data that spits out, you don't care how it got spit out, but it's spitting out in the right format and saying the right kinds of things
Right.
that you need it to say.
Right.
Allow for
So-
differentiation on the other side of the map.
It's a need that I think is being addressed everywhere. And one of my good friends works at Bank of America. They use the same kind of, like it's not just a government, it's a thing. And it's a thing that's really gotten pushed forward because of COVID and everybody working
Right.
from home.
Right.
And so now I agree, like having the standards written, it's gonna come out at some point. Why not?
Yeah, and it is a DevSecOps topic.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, somebody's gonna do all of these APIs without any thought whatsoever to secure it.
Yes. Yes.
And which certificates are involved and how things get authorized and all this stuff is gonna be thrown out the side. Yes, that's exactly right. The labs will say, this is spin one.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's got holes in it.
Paul, do you want to say something?
Yeah, this is a great conversation, but what's the minimal viable standard here?
Right. Well, I think, so that's a great tee up for what I want to say before we lose everybody today. Really, the standards process is a show up and participate. We've got great conversation here, but the way the process works at the OMG is the task force comes together and talks about, and they kind of put together what's called an RFP. It's a request for proposal for a specification. So the next step that we need to do is we're going to get together and we can set aside a decent chunk of time in June to sit down and say, okay, what's the first RFP we think we want to go after? And that's the RFP is asking for a proposal for a standard in a specific area. And we can start laying out the requirements for that RFP. And then it's a coalition of the willing on their own nickel who's going to show up, and we can embarrass them to get here. That's kind of what standards are for. And you get resource sponsors, you get permission, you get funding, and you get all the right people.
Be careful, because you're going to, you can potentially run counter to proprietary infrastructure. And having watched this for almost 30 years now, you can also run into this problem where the business interests run counter to what you're doing.
Yes.
So you want to make sure you do good work.
Yes.
At the same time, as you get closer and you've got momentum and so forth, it'd be great to have, if you can pull incumbents in, go for it.
Well,
one of the things that I got into, because I went to a meeting in Europe, and NATO got up and says, we have no influence in the standards. I said, show up.
Yes.
Right? I mean, and I've heard that so many times. Well, we want to influence this. I said, show up.
Right.
Right? Get involved. Put your fingerprints on it. Your customer, the memberships are very cheap. I think for DOD it's $12,000, however they break it up a year. and you show up, whether it's virtual or online, whatever else. I tell the Canadian government the same thing. Well, if you want to have your influence in these things, show up and participate.
Find a proxy if
Right.
you can't afford it.
Especially for the LG, I don't know if you're understanding it beyond. You don't go outside.
We do.
Hold it a
We do
second,
it.
hold it.
The Canadian is gonna jump all over.
You gotta connect.
You know, we're the foreigners to a variety of people in the room.
Right. Wait, I'm just saying, like, we're having them come. So it should be me.
He wants to go.
Your OMG.
She's trying to pay for the trip.
I don't know if it's happening right now in like the new world order of COVID, right? But previously,
Yeah.
pre-pandemic, right?
Right.
There was a European meeting every year.
Obviously, Monaco's are high on the list.
I'll vote for Monaco.
There's one common thread that each of you guys hit on in a different way. I don't want this to be lost. Commander Hunter, you shared this. Every one of you guys talked about common ground with terms. Like the vocabulary is off.
Mhm.
And if I was going to identify a minimal viable standard, I'd say get your glossary right, get your lexicon right. Here's an opportunity for the OMG to at least come up with some clear terms, saying here's what we believe it means, and then you can have those next conversations.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm involved in other standards bodies. You asked a question earlier, like what common thing has happened in other standard bodies? There was something called the Fed Up. I won't get into the details, but it's an IEEE standard based on HLA. Then they came out with DSIP, which is the Distributed Simulation Engineering Execution Process. That's a guideline. There's two different types of standards that come out of CISA, which is different than OMG. There's guidance and specifications. I would say you guys probably, because I feel like I'm part of this too, we probably need a guidance document before we start really hosing in on specifications.
You're aiming at what I was gonna try to extend it, and that was that it's not just get together and let's decide what the first standard should be. Over in the Space Task Force, which you let it come here for, the idea is you first come up with a roadmap, right?
Mhm.
And that lays out a plan that is crystal, people can see that, and this is where our initial standard fits. And this is where it's gonna fit in the future as we're sort of moving.
Which I'll get into OMG and the problems just dealing with OMG. Staff people here. When we
Terrence is not
developed the
listening.
information exchange reference architecture, there was a lot of opposition to OMG coming out of reference architecture. Because it wasn't necessarily a specific implementation of PISM. That you would have, and you'd have it in 18 months or whatever else.
And the task force I'm on got an awful lot of flack for putting out a UML model.
That's right.
So now we're talking about
But we did it.
basically a process, right? And ontology model for that set up, so you have that vocabulary taxonomy, plus what the process basically looks like, okay, from a standards point of view. That would be brand spanking new for OMG.
But if the membership wants it, we can make it happen.
I'm not saying, but it's basically getting the staff in the room and the MP in the room and say, this is the direction we want to go and have to go.
All right, so let's do some brass, let's put our, shut up, let's do some brass tacks in here, let's make some decisions. Okay? So, I think everybody's comfortable with some of this lexicon, right? These terms, right? You know,
It's
this is
everywhere.
the cyber.mil paper also. So this could be, right, and they break this down into a lot of granularity. You know, they got 15 bullets on what plan means in different areas of plan.
It's the boundary of the chevrons. Right.
But in terms of your roadmap, I think a roadmap's a great idea. If you have a roadmap of standards objectives,
Yes.
right? The standard objectives, the problem that we are going to solve in plan, just to pick on that first, right? The objective in plan is we see the following requirement, and this is like 4 or 5 bullets. There's a statement of requirement for what the initial RFP for plan will be, and we don't have to say that's first. But we just basically come up with one of these, at least one for each of these areas that describes because then it makes a very simple taxonomy, and then we have to get into this discussion of what do we want to solve, right? What do we want to actually solve in those areas? As you know, cleaver points, and it could be guidance, right? So, you know, the testing could be a guidance thing. Or the testing could be very meaty and say, we want something where, you know, you know, there are various technologies that make it fairly easy from Bash or PowerShell or various scripting languages to, you know, Python, et cetera, to drive infrastructures, right? They're mappings to these systems. And so you could actually have an interface, an ideal interface that describes the testing APIs, network testing API. But they can have requirements for how the test, you know, how is it that test will work so that you have the appropriate certificates and you have the right authentication mechanisms, right? To make sure that only the authorized testing infrastructure can drive the test as opposed to anything that happens to be around. And do you see what I'm saying? Right? That we just pick some, and it doesn't really matter what we pick first. Having worked around OMG for a long time, I recommend something somewhat, you know, esoteric that won't get a lot of
Something
attention.
that's not ready.
Yeah, I agree with that. You've got to go after something that's going to make a big splash, that has high added value, but is
But doesn't
doable.
threaten.
I would argue the opposite.
Usability high, right? Impact high. So it's like, yeah, I agree with picking the roadmap and saying, we want to apply certain concepts in each one of the chevrons, right? Got that, right? But you got to get the excitement from the industry. And in order to do that, you've got to have something,
It's gonna
you
add
know,
value.
to ruffle their feathers sufficiently that they will show up in the room. And then you've got momentum, right? Once you got momentum, things really start happening.
Do you want that excitement? Because that excitement, right, this will turn into marketing. And
Depends on bodies or support.
Yeah.
You don't know
So-
which one you're gonna get.
So there's this pattern that I've worked out over the years to doing things very, very quickly and very, very correctly, right? And this goes to safety critical and a bunch of other stuff, but it's a very simple pattern. You know, one of the things is you have to define the problem you're trying to solve, and it cannot be more than 5 bullets. You're not allowed to express it in more than 5 bullets. And I had this great argument with Ben Coloni one night when I was eating dinner with him. He goes, "You can't do that for Joint Strike Fighter." Absolutely, you can do that for Joint Strike Fighter. You can definitely define all the requirements for Joint Strike Fighter in 5 bullets. And he goes, "Okay, Bill, try." And I said, "Well, it seems to me that Lockheed needs to build an air superiority platform that exceeds all other air platforms in the world." He goes, okay, I'm getting your point. And I said, because you actually understand that better than the government does. You know more about the airplanes of the rest of the world than the government does, than the Air Force does. So, you know, that's your job.
You know, that almost goes back to the manifesto idea, because part of the beauty of the Agile Manifesto is it's only, what, 5 things?
Right.
It's only 5 things. You build.
So, okay, so but me not being necessarily a stakeholder, right? Or well, maybe a
But you
stakeholder, but not a
will be.
participant.
There's no way you won't be.
What's your point?
Sorry.
You confused them.
Yeah, you confused me.
You broke his
I'm
train.
wondering if what you're doing is valuable but too abstract. So I'm kind of like a boots on the ground kind of guy. So I like things I can sink my teeth into,
Mhm.
right? So you bring out the example of the F-35. So I can understand that it's going to be the greatest fighter in the history of the world. And the trouble is that everybody in this room has a different impression of what the greatest fighter in the
That's
history of the
not,
world
that's what I said. That's not what I said. It doesn't have to be a great spider. It just has to be better than everybody else and it has to
Okay,
stay
all
that
right.
way.
But
It has
still,
to stay that
the
way at all
people in the
times.
room
of
are
the future.
going to have, you know, their own idea of what that is. And I'm down at the level of,
Right.
well, it needs to actually be able to fly in the rain.
Yeah.
Which you can't do.
Well, then but it fails that requirement. So I do realize that writing very precise, they're called highly precise abstract statements,
Point out an
is very
interesting
tough.
dichotomy. We could either shoot at the low level and make my poor developer's life a little bit better, you know, for 10% of the market, or we can shoot at the high level and make it easier for the acquisition folks to buy the right thing.
Yeah, but.
Or
then
anywhere in
we get
between.
into my discussion of the upper bulb in strategic planning,
Yeah.
So,
right? And how does that?
So I've got kind of I guess coming into this from the side. So do you have a mechanism to be able to go across your membership and have everybody say, where do you play in these segments? Because I mean, if we look at the standards that kind of get written, I mean, this is, you kind of alluded to this, you know, Lockheed knows what everybody else out there. There are going to be players in each of those play spaces that are going to be best poised to identify, you know, what might be starting points for this. I'm just kind of curious whether or not you've got that membership, you know, that ability and or enough membership covering the areas that doing that type of data call might lead you in.
Right, so that's part of why we started this with an info day instead of an RFI. Because until I think we have a more targeted RFI, we'll get back piles of marketing material and have made no progress.
And there's two ways to go at this. Either you start drafting something and send it out to the membership.
Right.
So it's not a
Which I
whiteboard.
would
what do you
always
think?
recommend. You never ask for.
Right?
Go blank sheet of paper.
Starting point to throw
But
dark.
make sure you have it on one plate on your back. And say whether it's a manifesto, a 5-page draft overview of a manifesto, whatever
Right.
it is, that you go out to this, then you can go out to the membership and beyond.
Mhm.
Okay, because part of this is to bring more people into the club, so there's more, as I go fingers and toes to do the work.
Right.
Because the faster, more of those we have, the faster the work goes.
Yeah.
And
And I'll just kind of throw it out there. I mean, I was sitting here thinking about this as you guys were talking about it, but from my perspective, what would be most helpful, you know, from the government customer side is if you started at the high level and got, you know, maybe like one step down, because if we get our acquisition communities and program managers and everybody at that, you know, at the 4-star briefing level, kind of understanding the same language,
Right.
it will help. I mean, the largest portion of the conversation that you just had about the APIs and different things, most people that I'm dealing with right now will be retired before they would ever.
they don't know what
They're
an API
gonna
is.
understand,
Yeah.
you know, that level of detail.
But if you
They're
have
still
the-
making decisions that are impacting that.
there's not a single 3-star in the Air Force that wouldn't agree that that's Lockheed's job in that bullet requirement. So back to this thing to getting to records, there's 3 steps to this. Number 1 is the 5 bullets, and the 5 bullets are very hard to write. They require an excellent definition of the problem. They do not in any way tell anybody how you're going to do it. What it does do is describe how to recognize the solution. The second area is to, you have to pick a subset, maybe one, right? And Rockwell Collins did this when they did the formal methods for a particular security thing. And they just drilled down on one thing to do a proof point. And what you do is you write the lower level requirements. You make design decisions, right? I'm using DO 178B language here, but you make design decisions, and those design decisions are more precise requirements, the ones that might appear in an OMG RFP, et cetera, for a standard. But you are trying to constrain the effect. And then the third thing you have to have, because everybody goes, I don't know how to do this, is you got to have one example. It has to be written well. If it gets too controversial and, you know, it's a mess, it's got to be very crisp, very clean, very simple, and everybody goes back and forth through it 100 times to make sure it's very high quality, and then that becomes the reference model. And that's why we're saying if you pick something that's not controversial market-wise, you can get that done with all interested parties in achieving that objective, and now you have a reference model. So when some vendor comes in who's a test vendor and has all this cool test, you get LDRA in or somebody else who generates test code. And they look at this thing and they say, well, how does this play? And how do we write something? Well, here's what we did for, you know, operating, right? Here's what we did for the operating environment, had these requirements, and here are the lower level requirements. And this is the standard that we produced that achieves that objective. Because at the flag level, you're always going to deal with 5 bullets. And if you write the 5 bullets, every flag's going to go, You understand my problem? What happens frequently at the flag level is they go, you don't understand my problem, right? And they'll tell you, and they'll write those requirements for you. But it is the end effect, it's the seventh why. If you ask, why do we do DevSecOps? And then your answer to that, you ask why again, and you ask why again, like a little kid. Once you get to the seventh why, it's like, okay, are we having a religious discussion now? We did this with the Navy, right? There was a whole discussion about fault tolerance in ships, and why do we do fault tolerance in ships? And it's really stupid questions, like, why do you want part of the ship to work when the other part doesn't?
Yeah.
It sounds really stupid, but you get into the really good answers.
Right.
Yes, sir.
So Brian, Simon, you were about to chime in earlier, but we all kind of cut you off. Did you remember what you were trying to bark about? I know, you looked really animated all of a sudden, then.
The terminology and the glossary piece is what should be told RFPs and some RFPs. Because the total RFPs of the AB and you don't have the glossary terminology for all the terminology you want to put in the AB, in the RFP, then the AB will send you back until you have one. So actually that has to come first.
So there is, I thought, I misspoke, there's a ISO standard coming out that's in draft now, but there's one that came out just last year for DevOps, not DevSecOps. It is ISO 32675, and that, just on the preview, without having to buy the document, you can, it has some of the terminology in there, so at least that's a launch point with some of the terminology that's already standardized. And it's a little, it's light, but there's an opportunity there to add on the security part of it.
Right, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, as you're saying.
Right, it at least gives a launch point to build off of that.
Use words.
We incorporate it and we start doing it, it's free on the OMG side.
To also speak a little bit on behalf of the value that could be added for the government is a gap that exists right now. It's easy to see where the big programs exist and, the software factories and what's there. A big value for DevSecOps is there is a huge community of smaller projects and software development. And I heard a term today that I like is pilot purgatory. That transition for those teams to go from having, being kind of freewheeling to try to transition to a combat system or some other larger program, it's a very difficult transition. If they have access to best practices with their short-term money and they can hop on and just do their thing and make that transition because it's standardized, if they can transfer that, that's a benefit for industry. It's also a benefit for the government because they can benefit that much faster. You don't want something to flop because they don't have access to the tools and they haven't transitioned to a new sponsor yet. And another benefit to that is, let's say you have a customer that's more on the R&D side, but they want to make that transition. If you're standardized, it's an easier handoff.
Theaters were like SAP came. It was based on things like that, where you're trying to deal with building blocks of things that you could start with that were at least a little better. Right, so Jason, that may be able to leave.
Yeah, I apologize. I've got to step out. Great conversation. It's definitely something very interesting. That's a really great point. We don't call it pilot purgatory. We actually call it the valley of death because nothing grows for our combat system unless it comes to the big integrator.
Yeah.
But if we were able to get to where people weren't evaluating tools, but they were looking at particular functions within those areas and what the OQEs should be coming out of them, so that I could then use a free open source tool and I could show that mappability into like a very expensive tool that we might be using at the corporate level as it kind of moves through. It would actually enable maybe that to become a purgatory. That's something that's safe other than the valley of death for us with it. But yeah, I think this is a great start to the conversation. Thanks for Yeah, appreciate you coming out through.
Yeah.
And, just know it is possible to get some of this stuff through the government. It takes years.
Yeah.